So now let's get started and introduce our guest speaker. A native of New Jersey, Mr. Anton Schulzki moved to Colorado Springs while attending college. He graduated from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs with a Bachelor of Science degree in secondary education and social studies and a Master of Arts in History at UCCS in 2001. He started his teaching career at West Junior High School in D11 in 1983, where he taught until 1987 when he moved to Coronado High School. Since 1989, Mr. Schulzki has been teaching history and government at General William J. Palmer High School and has been teaching in the International Baccalaureate Program, IB, at Palmer since 1992. In addition to teaching in the program, he is an assistant examiner for the History of the Americas IB exam. While most of his career at Palmer has been teaching in the IB program, Mr. Schulzki is the Advanced Placement AP Coordinator and the IB Middle Years Coordinator for Palmer. In his little to no spare time, Mr. Schulzki is also the sponsor of SAGA, Sexuality and Gender Acceptance Club at the school. When it comes to civics, Mr. Schulzki has always been intrigued by the currents of history, especially the history of those that often do not appear in the pages of most history textbooks. While the past may not always serve as a guide to the future, it does begin to explain how we arrived at the present. History, after all, is the story of us, no matter who us is. In 2019, Mr. Schulzki was elected to a 4-year term on the National Council for the Social Studies Board, a vote unanimously endorsed by the Colorado Council for the Social Studies. Since his election, Anton held the role of Vice President of NCSS and is currently President-elect until July 2021, when he will start his term as president. Mr. Schulzki believes that one of the most challenging issues in the classroom today is creating and expanding relationships within various content medium, across disciplines, across levels, with parents, the public, and politicians. He also contends that social studies professionals need to be at the forefront of conversations with the public about how a social studies education is critical for our nation, now more than ever. Welcome, Mr. Schulzki.
Thank you, Shelley. I appreciate those words this morning. And good morning, those of you who are joining us from the Pikes Peak region, and for those of you who are joining us outside the Pikes Peak region. Thank you so much for being here. So when I was asked to kind of give a short talk today, I did kind of put together a bit of a presentation. As we go, it's not that I have this necessarily scripted, but we'll have an opportunity after the presentation to really kind of engage in dialogue and some questions and answers, because I think that's really one of the hallmarks of what we need to be doing in order to kind of rebuild the trust in our democracy. So with that, I am going to share my screen with you, and I'll kind of talk over this as we go. So there we are. And I'm just going to play with this to make sure that I'm not seeing me because it's distracting. Anyway, so our talk this morning is on civic education and rebuilding trust in our democracy. I'm going to subtitle this, and I stole this line, is a dream a lie if it don't come true, or is it something worse? And hopefully both civic education and our democracy are not dreams, but in fact, something that we can be working on. So let's take a look at our last election, right? Our last election, we had incredible numbers come out in terms of the number of people who voted in the November 2020 election. And most of you are probably aware of this. It was unprecedented, obviously, in the number of mail-in ballots or drop-off ballots, depending upon how you want to kind of characterize those, as well as, of course, tremendous lines for early voting. And we saw people, coming out. And this was, right, we have to remember that most of this is happening before vaccines are rolled out. And so people really kind of took their their duty, their civic duty, with a great deal of, they were very interested in kind of doing this. Now we know, by the way, that according to the Pew Research Center on about statistics about the 2020 election, some 158.4 million. That's 158.4 million Americans cast their ballots in the 2020 election. That represents something along the lines of 6 out of every 10 adults and nearly 2/3 of all eligible voters nationwide. And we know that that's probably the largest number in terms of percentages that actually voted in a presidential election since 1980. So, incredible numbers there. And here in Colorado, right, we have to kind of, reach around and pat ourselves on the back. We had nearly over 72% of eligible voters voted in the election. We get the tag for being the 3rd highest rate in terms of voter participation. For that, highest, by the way, went to Maine, New Hampshire. Vermont was right up there as well. But so, yay us. So I want to step back for just a minute from the 2020 election, because I think it's necessary before we go beyond the 2020 election to take a short but necessary journey in looking at both civics and social studies education. And in my case, this is going to go back, a good 37, 38 years. This is my 37th year in education. So this kind of starts with the beginning. When I entered into the teaching force in 1983, that was when a book was published called A Nation at Risk. Some of you who are here may remember this, and this stood really as kind of a condemnation of the American education system. But we have to remember, right, this was during the days of the Cold War still going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union still existed. And it was a giant push towards revitalizing and re-energizing American education. Now, over the next decade or so, that takes us into the 1990s, what came out of that really was the first real kind of educational standards movement across the country. And remember that this is these are state initiatives that took place to kind of move things along. And so, for example, the standards movement here in Colorado in the 1990s wrote standards for social studies. We actually designed assessments for social studies across the state. And what came out of that was something called the CSAP. Those of you who are educators here may remember this. Those of you who certainly follow the news for a long time, CSAP was the way to go. Unfortunately, due to budget constraints, the social studies portion of the CSAP test was cut before it was even tested. We had worked several years on producing what we thought were going to be really good assessments, but state legislature came in and said, no, we need to kind of cut funding. And social studies was among those courses, subjects that decided not to be tested. Instead, of course, we place a great deal of emphasis on reading and writing, mathematics, and as a result, there was some kind of unintended consequences as a result of all of this. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. Out of that came in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act, passed in a bipartisan fashion back in 2001, stood really as one of the cornerstones of the George W. Bush presidency. That placed a great deal of emphasis again on teaching towards assessments, and those assessments continue to focus, I should say, on English language skills, math, reading, writing, and math. Out of that, in the late by 2009, 2010 or so, the Common Core State Initiative began. Again, we don't have a national curriculum. And the Common Core state standards was kind of the closest thing to come to that. And again, we were testing things along the way. Now, having said that, however, my organization, the National Council for the Social Studies, a member-driven organization of nearly 10,000 social studies professionals from pre-K through university, we worked on and developed our own sort of national curriculum standards. This would not, of course, dictate what was taught, but it was certainly looked as a framework for how states could infuse a rigorous social studies education into their state standards. And Colorado certainly moved in that direction. Shortly there, this was updated in 2010, and shortly thereafter, NCSS developed what we call the college career and civic life, or the C3 framework for social studies education. And what this did was to kind of give some direction as to how to teach the standards. Inherent in all of this was really getting students to begin the process of inquiry, asking really good questions and finding out that information, learning to be the judges, of what good sources are, how to differentiate between a valid source and one that might be questionable, and how to use those sources to kind of put together an argument. And more importantly, take that and find some way of acting upon it, right? I think that was actually one of the key things that we wanted to do, was to kind of act on this. All of this sounds really good. It sounds awesome, right? We've got the Common Core standards, we've got the national curriculum, we've got the NCSS standards, we've got the C3 framework, and we've had the impetus to kind of go out there and do something. However, this is the bad part. It turns out that over the last number of years, quite honestly, what has happened is that social studies education has become marginalized throughout the country. 44% of districts that were surveyed as part of this have actually reduced time for social studies education since NCLB. Oftentimes well-meaning and well-intentioned, but quite honestly, misinformed administrators and school boards thought that the emphasis should be placed more on English, on reading and writing, forgetting in many, many ways that in a social studies education, we, social studies teachers, do a great deal of reading and writing. Again, we are evaluating sources, we're evaluating texts. And, unfortunately, however, in some cases, it was taken out completely from the schools, particularly the elementary schools, completely gone. There will be no social studies taught. Teachers were reprimanded by administrators for trying to teach social studies. And that's just, to me, it goes beyond how we kind of do things. Unfortunately, in my own school district, in the last year or so, we had a social studies supervisor, a facilitator, one who kind of looked at things for social studies education across the district. When she retired, we as a district we chose, I say we because I am part of that district, but the district administration chose not to rehire somebody in that position, and instead gave the overseeing of social studies to our English, our English language arts coordinator. And she's a wonderful person, and she's doing a marvelous job, but her background is not social studies. And to be fair, I wonder sometimes if that was a math person or the English language person, would we in fact not hire somebody to go and replace them? And of course, the answer is yes. But for whatever reason, social studies has kind of become, one that became the ugly stepchild, or however you want to kind of characterize it, and we kind of got shipped off to the side. And so as a consequence, civic engagement fell. We can kind of look at any number of kind of things. Now, I am not suggesting at any stretch that the marginalization of social studies led to, although there might be some evidence to suggest that it led to what happened on January 6th of this year, right? Because there was complete misunderstanding in terms of how our system works by individuals across the country. We had lawmakers who jumped in to reject election results, despite the fact that across the country, the evidence of voter fraud and manipulation of votes was absolutely minuscule at best. Now, we do know, and it is true, right, that in 2016, there were some objections raised in the US House regarding the election of former President Trump, but that delayed the vote by basically 25 or 30 minutes, and was really done by a handful of Democrats who were disaffected by the election results then. It was more symbolic. In this particular case, right, our own representative joined in to challenge those election results, and we still are kind of unfortunately kind of dealing with some of that fallout. Because when it comes to voting rights and citizenship, now this is now since November, okay? Since November, nearly 300 bills, and by the way, that number is probably climbing. This was literally information I got just the other day. But since November, there have been nearly 300 bills across the country that would restrict voting rights access to individuals because of some perceived slights or perceived malfeasance. Again, maybe perceived. We know that Georgia is one example that has been in the news lately, but Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, Arizona, and Pennsylvania have all introduced bills. Colorado actually introduced bills. Bills were introduced, but for example, in Colorado, they didn't go very far. On the flip side, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maryland are among 3 states that have introduced bills to actually strengthen voter rights and voter participation. And we see those as models of getting people involved in the system. And then in the congressional level, both H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, H.R. 1 is for the People Act, and H.R. 4 it's a John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Both of these would kind of supersede some of the state legislations and put things in and strengthen voter participation. Now, I think one of the things we have to kind of look at too, right, is the fact that in this country, there is not a single uniform system of voting. Our system allows the states to set up voting procedures. So in theory, you have 50 plus secretaries of state who oversee the votes in their states. And in some cases, that's even left up to local jurisdictions as to how and where and when voting can take place. So we really have this kind of mishmash of voting rights and laws across the country, which probably contributes to some of the situations that we kind of come to grips with. So perhaps then the fault, as I suggest, is in our stars, but in ourselves, because we have set up such a system that is so diffuse and so decentralized, which may be a good thing, but has kind of led to a number of other things. I would argue the same is true when it comes to civic education. These are some headlines from some recent news articles about this whole idea of, can we use a citizenship test, right? For some, the idea of using questions from the immigration and naturalization test would be a good benchmark for finding out if in fact our students are learning anything about about citizenship and about government, and about history and that kind of thing. It's like, I think the current test is something like 120 odd questions. And so we had headlines right? Democracy needs to survive. We need civic engagement. People have to get involved. right? And we heard at the beginning of today's meeting that call for action for you right here is to kind of get involved. But it also, of course, is our students. The decline of civic education and the effect it's having on our democracy. Again, opining upon some of the problems that we're having here. The notion that civics is more than just citizenship. And so, there's been suggestions that we look at something called active civics or active citizenship, right, in terms of how we address things in our classrooms. Again, bemoaning the state of civic education, the decline of civic engagement, and why it matters so much for our system. And yet, all those headlines coincide with this one. Disgusted with Trump versus Clinton, so we get to blame America's civic education. All of these headlines that you see here came before the 2016 election. So this has been going on for some time, right? This has been going on for some time. And the National Council for Social Studies, of course, and as well as our state councils across the country, have been kind of urging politicians, legislators, and others that the time is now to kind of do some things. And so we need to find out, in fact, if there's a way out. And I tend to be a bit of an optimist here. I think there can be a way out for us to do this. Some more recent headlines, and by that I mean certainly since this past December, maybe even as early as this year. So we're now seeing headlines that are suggesting, particularly in light of everything, that students in fact need civics lessons. Okay, and we see that. Former Utah Senator Orrin Hatch penned an op-ed that it was titled "America is Facing a Civics Crisis," and he suggested here's how we can fix it. Okay, and so we have we've got people on both sides of the political spectrum who are suggesting we can kind of do things. And so what happens is that just within the last month, Congress introduced something called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. Now, Senator Hatch had actually pushed for this in the last Congress, but if you remember your civics, a bill that is introduced in one Congress and doesn't pass, kind of goes to, we have to start all over again. And so there had been a bill that had been put forward in the last Congress. It didn't go very far. It was introduced late within the sessions. It was reintroduced in March by a series of bipartisan senators and members of the House of Representatives. A number of them have signed a Dear Colleague letter in support of this. And so the goal behind this really, the Civic Secures Democracy Act, would promote grants, federal dollars to support civics education. Now, those dollars obviously don't flow immediately down to the districts or even to a classroom, but would instead go in the same way. Years ago, Congress had supported something called Teaching American History, which was a series of block grants that went to organizations that worked with history teachers, American history teachers, K through high school, to improve history education. I was fortunate enough to work on a couple of those, and those were absolutely some of the best, absolutely, in my 37 years of teaching, those were the best professional development that I attended and was part of, because it really brought the whole notion of being a historian to elementary, middle school, and high school teachers in a way that then they were able to kind of do things with their students. And we've seen it work on local levels. A colleague of mine for any number of years was doing amazing historical thinking with her kindergarten and first grade classrooms. And so the notion behind the Civic Secures Democracy Act would kind of do the same thing. And that would provide grants for organizations to kind of help run professional development, improving civic education. And then here in Colorado, SB 21067, which is now called the Senator Lois Court Civics Act of 2021, was put forward again with a bipartisan effort by a number of people here in Colorado, including my own state senator, Representative Terry Carver, a Republican who worked with a number of Democrats to put this forward. The bill changed a little bit from the time it was introduced until most recently. It appears that it has passed both the House and Senate, and will move to help strengthen some of our history and civic education here in Colorado. Now, interestingly enough, in the Colorado State Constitution, and some of you are maybe familiar with this comment, in the Colorado State Constitution, when it comes to teaching about anything in the schools, the Colorado State Constitution mandates only one thing and one thing only, that in order to graduate with a diploma from a Colorado school, one has to have an education in both government and U.S. history. It doesn't specify how. It simply just says there has to be education done in both in our government and our history. So, I mean, what the heck? It's in our state constitution. But as we also know, we are a local control state, and those are things that then kind of fall to local school boards to kind of make those decisions in terms of how things go. So let me go back to a little bit more to the Civic Secures Democracy Act and what will it do. And this, by the way, has a number of big time corporate, not just corporate sponsors, but also education, civic kinds of groups. The group CIVICS Now is really an offshoot of a group that started called CIVICS, and CIVICS provides free lesson plans for teachers across the country. And the genesis of CIVICS was the late Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who made it really her mission after she left the court to really help to expand citizenship and civics education. And from that, CIVICS was born. And now the kind of political arm of that, the CIVICS Now group is pushing for this. NCSS has also signed on as a supporter of this, although it's an interesting concept because we are a social studies organization, not just a civics organization. And so there's that sense of push and pull and balance between how much is too much civics, if there is such a thing, and are we then shortchanging other subjects? And so that, I think, will be a good discussion going forward, but that may be amongst the teachers as well. So it invests in American history and civics education. We're going to find a way to expand access to it. The big goals are really to protect the health of our democracy and to empower students to participate in our constitutional democracy. Now, I will say, here in Colorado, it's really kind of good in the fact that young people can pre-register to vote when they get their driver's license. And I think that's just an amazing thing, right? The fact that we are telling young citizens, hey, it may not be today, but the minute you are 18, you already registered, you can vote, and we will send you a ballot in the mail. And I think that does a lot to infuse more people who get involved. This past year, my seniors, many of them had turned 18 prior to the election, and we obviously talked about things prior to the election in our class, and they were truly excited to say that they actually participated in their first election, and many of them also then turned around and participated in our city in the most recent city election. So we're doing those kinds of things, and I think that's important because once we're able to kind of get our students to participate, then I think we can start talking about how we can improve things overall. So that's on the big national level. As we said here in Colorado, SB 21067 does a lot to kind of strengthen our civic education. One of the things it does is going to empower the State Board of Education and then the Department of Education to look very specifically at revitalizing and renewing our own state standards when it comes to civic education. And again, on a PK, and I say PK because my oldest daughter is a preschool teacher, and really we can start with citizenship with our preschoolers in terms of how we kind of do things. So that kind of puts things in light there. So here we are, and we think everything's going to be just awesome, just dandy. There's an opportunity for us to really reinvigorate what we're doing in terms of civic education. And we see, and by the way, these are just 3 headlines real quick. Again, that we saw recently. There's a bipartisan push for civics in Colorado schools that could save the republic. That's pretty awesome. Well, we're going to save the entire republic, but what we do here in Colorado, it showed that bipartisanship still works as well. And there were even some suggestions. You could look, for example, at Germany and some of the ways that they actually kind of nationalize their civic education for their citizens, could offer some civic lessons for the United States. So there's an impetus there to change things. And we're so excited, right? Not so much, because unfortunately, when it comes to teaching about government and when it comes to teaching about US history, like so many other things in our country right now, it becomes a partisan battle and really this almost test of wills. And so at the same time, we saw these 3 headlines extolling the virtues of a civic education. We see the greatest education battle of our lifetime is going to be about this whole notion of civics. And action civics, as it's been deemed, is more action than civics. And our students are not yet ready to be activists. Is in fact Congress falling for a scheme to ruin civics and history classes? You would think that we could get moving in that direction. And to be fair, right, within the last year or 2, we've seen that battle, particularly more in the study of U.S. history, with different organizations, blowback on how we even look at the founding of our country. States mandating, in fact, that some points of view cannot be taught at all. The most famous one of that is something called the 1619 Project, which really was a series of articles published in the New York Times back in 2019 on the recognizing the 500 years since the first African slaves were introduced into British North America. And what came out of that was a series of lessons to support education in the classroom. It wasn't meant to be an entire curriculum, but yet people who didn't read it or take the time to really examine it, there was that blowback. And there are state legislatures, by the way, that have now kind of basically said, if you use this, we will take money away from you. So it becomes U.S. history, teaching of U.S. history and teaching of government becomes a real big political football. What others have said about what we can do, and I think these are 2 quotes to me that kind of resonate. Democracy is not something that you believe in or something that you hang your hat on. It's something that you do. You participate. Without participation, democracy crumbles and fails. If you participate, you win, and the future is yours. And then an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. That shorter quote, of course, comes from Thomas Jefferson. The longer quote comes from 1960s activist Abbie Hoffman. Probably 2 individuals who may not have exactly seen things eye to eye. But fact of the matter is that they both agreed that an educated citizenry and an active citizenry are really the keys to kind of helping our democracy along. Interestingly enough, I recently attended a town hall meeting put on by Representative Carver, and the hot topic was in fact HB 21067. And the participants in the meeting, again, kind of well-meaning individuals, but sadly, I would argue not very well, not as informed as they could be. How about I put it that way? They were not as informed as they could be in terms of what actually happens in the schools these days. There was literally the belief among most participants that absolutely no civic education is being taught, and yet in virtually every school district there is a graduation requirement for at least one semester of U.S. government that's required in order for our students to graduate from high schools. My own district has that requirement. We've had it for as long as I've been here. So, and then of course, the other arguments that came up were, what are we doing about voting? I think it was 2 days before that town hall where people just seem to be not really knowing what's going on in the schools or knowing much about the actual legislation itself, because they were talking more about what goes into the textbooks. And most teachers will tell you that a textbook is a great tool, but we've moved beyond textbooks, to be quite honest. And in fact, many civics classes have a notion of some sort of participation, right? You have to get out and do something, whether it's a community project or a voting project or a mock Congress or whatever the case might be. And so anyway, the other day I was coming out of at my local grocery store, and someone was there asking me if I wanted to sign a petition and I have to remember exactly how she put it. It was either to strengthen our voting rights or make sure that the voter integrity. That's what it was. We wanted to improve voter integrity, which is really interesting to me because, you know, I tend to think that Colorado has a very secure voting system. Secretaries of state from Republicans and Democrats have extolled our system. Could there be some tweaks? Absolutely. Representative Carver talked about that in our meeting, saying that, you know, quite honestly, secretaries of state across the country need to do a better job of working with each other. Colorado does work with a compact of some 20 odd other states where secretaries of state really try to kind of cull the voter rolls of those who have been deceased, not so much those who have not voted, but actually those who are deceased or in fact move. So there's some ways that we can kind of do that. The other thing I think she talked about too, and this is where I would actually kind of agree with her, is that we, the collective we, this is the vox populus, if you will, right? The people have to kind of do our part to not only ask good questions, right? Don't just say, oh, I heard there was something. In fact, we need to have evidence. And at the same time, there needs to be probably a little bit more transparency in terms of our voting system. What voting systems are used. I mean, fortunately here in Colorado, we do have a paper trail for everybody who does sign and does vote. But again, we're kind of all over the place in this country in terms of how we participate in voting. I will be fair. I think our neighbors to the north, not Wyoming, but Canada, they actually have something called a national system called Vote Canada. And this national system is nonpartisan, specifically nonpartisan. And it sets up how ballots look across the country. In Canada, all ballots look the same and people vote the same way. And they actually is a paper ballot that they use in their voting. That same Vote Canada, for example, also gets involved in Canada, also has a representative democracy. They have voting districts in their House of Commons. Here, they're represented as districts. In Canada, they're called ridings, a nod to the British system as well. But in Canada, when they redraw riding boundaries, it is done by a nonpartisan commission that simply looks at geography as opposed to that other great contribution of American democracy, gerrymandering. So I think we have a lot to learn from them. I would not suggest, for example, that we necessarily follow the Australian model that basically says you vote or you pay a fine for not voting. That might be a little much. But I think we do have some ways that we can, in fact, strengthen it. And it has to start with our education. It really has to start with our young people. Unfortunately, I think sometimes those of us who have long since left education, our own education, haven't done enough to really kind of keep up with things. And that's pretty evident by some of the misinformation and confusion that is kind of out there. So with that, I'm going to stop my little presentation for now and figure out how the 25 or so of us who are here right now are going to save democracy here in El Paso County, Colorado Springs, El Paso County, Colorado, and the country. So I have not been keeping up with the questions. So we'll take a look at those that are in the chat, and feel free to fire away, because after all, a good social studies teacher should be entertaining questions. So.
Thank you, Anton. That was very informative. I got a lot of great notes as well. So we do have a couple questions in our chat, so we're going to get to those. What is the state of civic education in teacher preparation? It's actually kind of threefold. It's from Marjorie Gray. So are there requirements that all pre-teachers, no matter their major, take college courses to understand the fundamentals of our government? And how active is NCSS with teacher education?
So I will take that last question and feed it to the other two. Part of our organization, a large part of our organization, is a group called the College and University Faculty Association, or CUFA. And that's basically made up of college professors, some history folks, but mostly professors who are engaged in teacher education, right? So these are the people who are working with pre-service teachers or teacher wannabes in prepping them for a career in education. And so they're the ones doing the work at the university level, preparing that next generation of teachers. However, right, here's the problem. That works well for those of us who are going to become social studies teachers, right? Those of us who have a degree maybe in history or in government, or have a passion for social studies and decide that that's what I want to teach. And so when they go through their teacher preparation programs, they're oftentimes being told how to do the best kinds of lessons and how to really work with kids. And a lot of them, by the way, use that C3 framework in regards to how we should be doing things in the classroom. That said, our elementary teachers who are absolute heroes, right? I mean, they're absolute heroes. Unfortunately, they're given the task of teaching everything, right? They're gonna teach some science, they're gonna teach some history, some government, some English language arts, and math, and the whole bit. And so there's not always that dedicated focus, if you will, towards teaching social studies necessarily in teacher prep for all of our elementary pre-K, through probably 6th or 7th grade. That middle school is a little bit of everything. So we could be doing a better job, quite honestly. My own daughter's education at UCCS. Now, granted, she got a bachelor's of innovation degree, which was kind of this weird combination of early childhood education, special education, and business, in case she wanted to go out and start her own, Miss Avery preschool. But there's very little in terms of actual social studies kinds of things that they do there. I will argue that at our upcoming National Council for the Social Studies Conference in Minneapolis this November, put in a plug, one of our key themes is actually early childhood social studies in the early childhood education. So we're doing some work there. Long-winded, but I got 3 questions at once.
Awesome. Julie, I see you posted. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Anton, can you speak to the Colorado Department of Education standards that must be taught regarding civics, and specifically any standards that might prepare and or encourage students to participate in?
Sure. So sorry, I've got cats deciding to run around here. What would a Zoom meeting be without cats, right? Cats or dogs? So the current Colorado standards are a K through 12, and they do address all four areas of social studies: history, civics, economics, and geography. And each has its own set of standards that are basically that are broad, but have some suggested lessons at each grade level. And one of the cornerstones is actually that notion of participatory democracy, right? Getting kids involved in whether it's maybe making rules up in their own classroom, which is a form of civic engagement at a younger level, to at the high school level, actually going out and voting and participating in elections or campaigns in that respect. So there is that there. I think the new law will kind of also ask the Department of Education, us educators, to re-examine those a little bit. The new law doesn't specify a whole lot, but it's going to require that the Department of Ed take a long, hard look at what we're doing and seeing what works and what doesn't work. But unfortunately, we really don't have any kind of really good assessment data other than some national tests, the NAEP test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which kind of is a snapshot across the country. There's not much in terms of Colorado. We did have some assessments in social studies, but again, the testing requirements got to be really onerous, and both parents and educators and students, so I would say all three, have kind of pushed back. And so this year, the state legislature basically did away with, and there hadn't really been a good high school test. We had delivered one a couple of years ago, but they basically took the high school social studies test off the charts. There's a little bit of stuff that happens in the SAT and the PSAT, but in all honesty, that's mostly a reading comprehension exam. So it doesn't really get to the heart of what are you doing in terms of active citizenship. Now, I do know that there are a lot of programs in many schools that are extolling civic participation. It's part of the International Baccalaureate program, which is involved in many schools throughout our region. There is a requirement that the students be actively involved in the community, and so that community involvement, I think, takes on that notion of things. And I've had students over the years involved with campaigns. I'm proud to say that a number of my former students, have worked for a number of legislators, both in Colorado as well as nationally. And in fact, one of my former students basically ran now President Biden's data campaign behind the scenes in terms of elections. And she was the one basically reassuring everybody on election night, just it'll be fine. So there you go.
We have another question in chat, Anton, from Sharon Jameson. I don't know, Sharon, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, or if Anton can just read that. I see.
I see it there. Concern about. Go ahead, Sharon. Did you want to repeat your question?
Oh, I can repeat it. Yes. I have long been concerned about the extra demands that have been put on the public schools. There's demands for reading, writing. I was working in the public schools when certain numbers of minutes were required each and every day for reading, writing, and math. Wonderful goals, extra testing requirements. I remember when my kiddos, when the testing first came in, my children were literally tested 8 to 9 weeks every school year for one thing or another, which is, I'm not going to argue with those goals, but it seems to me that the state legislators are now offering an insufficient amount of time to meet all of the goals. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, as well as whether or not there are movements afoot. Because I love that addition of civics, but We need more time.
Well, I mean, you know, let me go back to the notion of reading and writing, for example. When our students are learning, right, there's that notion, and those of you who are early childhood educators will know this a little bit better than I do, right? That notion that in that first couple of years of schooling, our students are learning, in effect, how to read, right? They kind of break down the simple, whether it's phonics or whatever the case might be. And then from there, probably from grades 4 or 5 on, it's using reading for learning, not learning to read, but reading to learn. And that's, I think, right where is an area where, the infusion of good, solid, whether it's government, civics, or history, or any of the social studies, I would say social studies, period. You can use the teaching of social studies to learn to read to learn. Because it doesn't matter what you're reading, right? You're reading to learn something. Now, there's a difference between, how we evaluate, for example, a poem versus how we might evaluate a primary source. But we're still using those same techniques. And I think that's an area where if we don't have that time, we can use that time far more wisely. Okay. When it comes to actual teaching time, I don't have much in the way of how that is dictated. That is something that's dictated by the state. The state sets the number of minutes or hours in terms of what schools what are required for education. How that calendar is put together then is up to the individual school districts, as our members who are here on local boards can testify. And so it's also up to the local communities to make those decisions. There are some schools that have adopted, some districts that have adopted a calendar that shortens summer breaks. There are others with maybe a few more breaks in between. There's adjustments that can be made to start and end times for school days, those kinds of things. So, that's something that's going to come from the public ultimately. So, I think, and whether or not the politicians and others are willing to listen.
Thank you, Sharon, for your questions, and keep them coming. It looks like we got another one from Anna. I'm going to let you unmute so you can kind of, I'm sorry, Marjorie, I probably should have done that with your original one, but I was just kind of going with the flow. If you have another one, I want you to post that for us and be able to speak. But Anna, if you are going to unmute, if not, I can read that for you, or Anton can get it. I miss you here.
Okay, I assume I'm unmuted, I'm not sure. You mentioned that history, civics, information can be integrated into English and reading. Is our school curriculum, especially at the middle school and high school level, too fragmented and isolated by subject? I know as a math teacher, it frustrates me that math and science aren't more integrated. Could you talk about this?
Sure. And so I'll come to this in a couple of different ways. So coming to it as a social studies teacher, a long-time social studies teacher, I have worked really closely with some colleagues, particularly in the last number of years at the high school level of putting together a curriculum that could be taught and was in fact taught. It's an interdisciplinary curriculum that was taught in my English classes and our social studies classes. So for example, our students would pick a topic that relates to government, and specifically something that they want to change as part of our system. And they would begin that research in social studies class, but then they would also carry that same topic into their English classes, where they would use that same topic to produce what my English colleague would call a multi-genre forms of writing or communicating, right? Whether it's a speech, a formal letter, and that was widely successful. My colleague and I, we presented actually several years ago what we did to the National Council of Social Studies conference in Washington, D.C. It was very well received, and it invited, for example, one of the things that the students did was to send letters out to state representatives, and we actually then were able to bring in Representative Exum and one other, Mark. from the West Side. Sorry, Mike, I haven't had all my coffee yet. So I think that's there. When it comes to, math and science, I'll be honest with you, that's something for the math and science teacher to kind of tackle a little bit. We do cover, obviously, in our classes, we look at statistics, we look at pie charts and graphs, and there is some math that's involved, but it's not going to be calculus, at least not in my classroom. I think part of what we would study, for example, was actually the history of science. And Mark Snyder, yes, thank you, Julia. So yes, so there's that integration there. I know that our math and science teachers would probably like to be a little bit more integrated. One of the aspects of the International Baccalaureate program at what's called the middle years level, grades 9 and 10, is that the schools consciously move towards investigating this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And so I'm hoping in my new role at Palmer High School, we're going to begin to kind of look at that. This was not the year to take on any new challenges in education. This was a year where everybody's hanging on by their fingernails. So anyway, thank you for the questions.
All right. And I was to say, I think we've got, it's almost time for our break. I do have one thing. So in your slide presentation under the No Child Left Behind slide, it said, is our children learning? Is that really a quote from our former president? Is our children learning?
I'm sorry, it is what? If it's not taught, it's tested? Or it's not tested, it's not taught. In
your slide back on where it mentioned the No Child Left Behind Act, and it had a quote underneath there that said, is our children learning? Was that a quote?
I believe that was a quote that was attributed to former President Bush, who, at times, and we all fall from this, right? At times we trip over our words. I probably did that in the last 30, 40 odd minutes. So, unfortunately for President Bush, he got kind of saddled with that one.
I guess my real question is, as we go on and go forward with the league, we are obviously civic and engaged citizens, else we wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning for a few hours.
Right.
What can we do as a group, as an organization, to kind of, I guess, help in this area? What else can we do?
So I think the league has always stood, right? And the fact that you guys were, right, we share that same anniversary, right? You guys are 100 years old, I believe, at the national level. So is NCSS. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary in the last year or so. And I think the league has always been noted for being that kind of nonpartisan voter participation group that really brings really good ideas to the voters. And I think for this group, it really is going to come down to how do we get people to talk to each other about voter integrity, right? The fact that here in Colorado, our system works. Is it 100%, the best thing since, whatever? No, probably it could use some tweaks, but this group and others have got to really start talking to people that, we can't be throwing out we can't be throwing everything out. Our system fundamentally has some good things to it. And we have rights to ask questions, but I think those questions have to be based on what kind of evidence do you have, and not something that, oh, hey, my brother just sent me an email. True story. My brother just sent me an email from a source that, quite honestly, I would have my own students questioning the validity of that source. And yet, here's a well-educated, well-meaning individual sending this stuff, and I'm going, why? I put our faith in the future in the groups that are coming. I see young people who are involved. Maybe I'm spoiled in the fact that so many of my kids are involved, and hopefully that their kids will continue that. So I think that's the kind of message that groups like the league can put out there.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you for that guidance. It looks like we're just a few minutes ahead of schedule. If anyone has anything else, right? I like that.
Right?
Very good.
Good. Well, I want to thank everybody for all the work that you guys do. and, being out there and asking hard questions and supporting voting rights and voter participation. And look forward to working with everybody. If you have any questions, you can certainly email me. My website on the District 11 page is available. I certainly can entertain questions there. And hopefully we will see more people in about when it comes to voting.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.